In this section, we'll look at some of the fashion and fads of the 1970s. Fashion was really eclectic and throughout the decade. It varied as the decade progressed and among different subgroups. Certainly women in the early 1970s still had a lot of the hippie look. You had the peasant blouses shown on the left here. Still had hot pants and mini skirts and boots, and they still wore a lot of fringes and tassels, which all of that sort of had its roots in the 1960s hippiedom. Bell-bottom pants were really popular throughout the 1970s in both genders, and as the decade progressed, women wore things like platform shoes and wide-brimmed hats. You see cosmetics and makeup becoming popular, which had actually declined among women in the 1960s. There were some stars in the glam rock of the 70s, and you know, people like David Bowie shown here in the middle. Well, they sort of symbolized an androgynous look that many people adopted. You see them throughout here, people that kind of appear to have traits of the opposite sex. Throughout the 1970s, denim was really popular among both genders, and it was often styled and ornamented with such things as rhinestones and, you know, designs and things sewn into it. T-shirts were much more common for both genders, and you begin to see them mass-produced with designs and advertisements or messages, which it, you know, hadn't been as the case in the previous decades. As the number of women increased in the business and professional world, they wore pantsuits, and you can see some of the common pantsuits here. In the early 1970s, women still wore their hair straight and long like they did the previous decade, but as the decade progressed, a new shag or feathered look became popular, which was made popular by the actress Farrah Fawcett, who's the woman in the middle here. You can see her. That hairstyle was very popular. You do see African American haircuts, the Afro, popular, and also perms are popular. By the end of the decade, some women supported shorter hair, but it was still, you know, frequently styled with curls and wings type of styles. While many men just kept it simple with the t-shirt and jeans and tennis shoes, by the late 1970s, many men preferred polyester shirts with wide lapels and bright colors. They would tuck them in their shirts but unbutton them halfway down the chest, and they would wear gold necklaces or medallions, and, you know, they would try to show their chest hair. It was all part of the disco image. For casual wear, many men embraced the so-called leisure suits, and they always had wide lapels, and they sometimes came with vest. When men wore shorts, they often wore them short and tight, and they'd have high athletic socks. Men's hairstyles varied widely throughout the decade. Sideburns and facial hair were popular in the decade, but they began to fade as the decade passed. There were numerous fads throughout the decades. For example, the lava lamp and black lights. And you'd have a black light and you'd put up black light posters that would reflect it. And that was something that my generation grew up with. I had black lights in my bedroom. Things like pet rocks, kind of silly, were popular, and earth shoes, a vestige of the 1960s. You also see the beanbag chairs. We had some of those in my house. Some of the fads include streaking, where you would have people stark naked running across in a public place and shocking everybody, and that include, as you can see here, I believe it was at the Oscars, you see actor David Nevin there and a streaker running across on stage behind him. Another trend was the CB radio, and, you know, something truckers had used for a long time, but people would listen in with the CB radios or truckers and communicate between themselves. Of course, this was before the cell phone. In 1972 Olympics, the American Frank Shorter won the gold medal in the marathon, and that really helped spark a running boom. And later in the decade, 1977, Jim Fixx, who was a writer, wrote the complete book of running, and it became a bestseller. And all of this sort of led the 1970s into the decade where people started jogging. You know, by the end of the decade, joggers were everywhere, and you had these foot races, the 5K, 3.1 mile, or the 10 kilometers, 6.2 miles, all the way to the marathon. Every big city had these. They were everywhere. And the running shoe industry exploded as well. You see Nike Incorporated, which had been founded in the 1960s by a former University of Oregon coach and another University of Oregon runner, Bill Bowerman and Phil Knight, respectively. Nike really begins to grow marketing to this new running boom. Other fads included the famous smiley face that in the early 1970s two brothers in Philadelphia had marketed, and it came with the slogan, "Have a nice day." And you might think, obviously, when you watch the movie Forrest Gump, it's kind of humorously talking about where that came from. But the smiley face was marketed on everything: watches, coffee cups, t-shirts, and so forth. The 1970s were a decade in which there was two really famous marketing slogans on behalf of states. Virginia had a very famous slogan, "Virginia is for lovers," and it was everywhere. And New York City had the first use of a heart to indicate love. So, you know, the image was, "I heart New York," "I love New York," and that was adopted. The heart was adopted by many other marketers. In any event, this concludes a section on some of the styles and fashions and fads of the 1970s.